Now, to explain the subtitle there, let me refer back to Sananda Basu's heartwarming and multifaceted talk. She talked about doing CEDAR level awesome science by using radio propagation disturbances. And one way to do that is to observe a radio propagation disturbance, and then you take the ray from where you're making the measurement, map it back to the source, and where that ray intersects the ionosphere, you go forward and do ionospheric physics. The purpose of the radio propagation disturbance is to get the Department of Defense to put up some money for the physics. And it works that way very well. Now, to go further, you need two ingredients, and it was very much a tribute to Santame Basu. I think I give Sante credit for that. To do some of the seminal measurements in one ingredient you need, which is structure, and that's the purpose of this talk. And the second part of it is propagation. You have to understand the propagation disturbance. Now, that's something that I've been working on for 25 of the last 40 years, and Sante was very much worked with me a lot on that and did some of the seminal work. And I've got a new result to show you at the end of this talk, which really suggests that I think we finally got it right. So let me see if I can put all that together in the next 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, the first part of the talk is to say, what do we mean by intermediate scale structure? Now, in all of these physics models, you're dealing with a three-dimensional space and evolving in time. And by some means to extract the order from it, you've got to break up what you're observing or modeling into a component that I'll call the slowly varying average. That's the background component. And then there's this next part of it, which is the structure component. So you're really imposing a stochastic model onto a physics model, and how those two come together, sometimes taken for granted, but it needs some thought. And the key point to making that separation is there's a difference in scale between the two components. One of them is evolving more rapidly than the other, and I've put a constraint in this model, which is one that says that we're really dealing for this class of structure frozen irregularities. If the structure is actually working to a dispersion relationship, it's falling into a smaller scale structure that would just put in a separate category for the time being. So this is what I'm talking about, is intermediate scale structure. To put dimensions on it, it's from the structure that goes from 100 kilometers or so, a little smaller, all the way down to a few hundred meters. Now, this was my first CEDAR talk, and David gave me some pointers to say, be sure you motivate what you're saying. So the next three slides are the motivational part, and I'll assume that you're now motivated, and I want to cut right to the chase. This is equatorial spread F. And you've seen these kinds of beautiful pictures that are put together. This one was given to me several years ago by John Rederer when I was just trying to get back into this. And what I was keenly interested in was the structure part of this model. Now, the interesting thing about that is, first off, is the point is this is a really highly inhomogeneous structure, even in the transverse plane that's cutting across the irregularities. Okay, so that's one part of the problem. And then there's this enormous anisotropy. So before you even get to talking about structure, you've got really quite a detailed problem here. And one of the things that I highlighted in red, for those of you who have mastered the art of doing this kind of calculation, you know, when you set up an instability within a plasma computation, that instability will generate structure that's so fine that pretty soon your computational grid can't handle it. And if you don't deal with that in some formal way, that instability will make hash out of your beautiful picture. It will just explode. So the only way you can treat that is by putting artificial numerical diffusion into the computation. So not only is this calculation limited to about 5 kilometers in resolution, that 5-kilometer regime is already being affected by a diffusion process that's not physics. So with all of that in mind, I was saying this is really a process that sets the structure or the environment for where structure develops. And I was trying to develop a three-dimensional picture of this to motivate how I was thinking about it, and then I found it on the internet. Now, there's a movie that goes with this, and I won't try and turn it on because it's coming from the internet. I didn't have the means of taking it off the internet and putting it together. But this is the three-dimensional picture of those two pictures that I showed you, and it shows what the details of the structure of equatorial spread F really is, and it's a collection of enormous striations. They are occupying the entire, I think you understand the dimensions of that. That's the magnetic, long magnetic field lines for thousands of kilometers, and those slice planes through there are pictures that might map into what you just saw. So the question is, how do you build a stochastic structure model that realistically represents this? And I said, well, gee, one way to do it would be to look at a configuration space model, and that's generally something that's motivated by the physical picture that you see here. And it's very old. It's not new at all. This was done back in the 60s, or 70s anyway, probably the early 80s, to actually build what they called configuration space models, in which the striations around the field lines were just physically modeled and then thrown together into a distribution. And you can set that distribution together in such a way that it will generate an inverse power law structure in the transverse plane, but once you map out of that plane, things get complicated very quickly, and that's the part of the process that I think is missing right now. So let me just then move on to now, I want to dwell on this a little bit, since I'm already 3 slides from the end of the talk, because this is a genuinely exciting result. I really wish Santi were here to see it, although it was taken 10 years ago. I only became aware of this piece of data just a year or so ago. And the really incredibly interesting piece about this is that these are from geostationary satellites. The upper frame is VHF scintillation, and the lower frame is L-band scintillation. Now, the two propagation paths are not coincident. That's clear from the structure. In other words, that two frequencies going through the same propagation disturbance would show the disturbances correlated on the two frequencies. So these are two displaced propagation paths, but they're going through similar structure. So as time marches on, this is a typical nighttime disturbance, and this is those plume structures that I just showed you crossing a propagation path. And this propagation path happens to be pretty nicely cross-field lined. So some of the distortions that might occur as you move off of those geometries are not present here. And this is the sort of thing that says, I don't know immediately if it strikes you what's really incredibly surprising about this result. Normally you'll think that scintillation at VHF maps directly to L-band. If you got strong scintillation at VHF, you would have somewhat weaker scintillation at L-band, but the two are, you can map one from the other. I mean, that's the way the theory works. But at 2,500 hours there at UT, all of a sudden the VHF scintillation got stronger and the L-band scintillation virtually went away. Now, those were the same propagation paths. Now, the question is that that's so counterintuitive to the propagation theory that you would say it was hopeless. But I started some work some time ago, which Charlie Serrano picked up, and we actually set into a computational framework this theory of strong scatter. And I won't even show you any of the details of that, except to say that those integrals, it's really just a double integral that you have to solve to do this. And if you can reduce the problem to a double integral, I mean, sooner or later you ought to be able to integrate that. Now, this double integral broke every integration algorithm we could throw at it, from MATLAB to Mathematica to IDL, and finally Charlie gave up and wrote his own routines and managed to get some very clean integrations, and this is what came out of it. So what you see in this picture are 4 measured intensity spectral density functions. Now, because of Fresnel filtering, there's no particular problem in doing spectral analysis on intensity. If you're doing spectral analysis on phase, you've got this intrinsic inhomogeneity to deal with, and conventional spectral analysis really doesn't work very well. You tend to go to maximum entropy methods or hypothesis testing or something that says I'm really looking for a two-component power law model inside of a many millions of data points across the spectrum and dealing with this. But this is just plain measured spectrum. And then the question would be, what does theory say about this if you process each one of these things independently? And that is the red lines that are going through these data sets. So the propagation theory says if you just analyze this data and do what Charlie calls the iterative parameter estimation, but it's very familiar to this group. In other words, you've got a physical piece of data there that's telling you you measured something, and then you've got a physical theory that's got some parameters in it, and you just keep moving those parameters around in some orderly way until everything fits. And that's what iterative parameter estimation comes down to. So if you look to the numbers on the left sides of those plots, then you see that the underlying theory is purely an inverse power law, a one-dimensional inverse power law, and it has a turbulent strength parameter, which is that CKL in there, which is one dimension or one parameter in the power law spectrum, and the other one is the spectral index. Now, you see right off the bat, if you're calibrated to simulation, these kinds of spectra that drive these processes would have a slope somewhere around 3. This is already a bit steeper, which drives the process harder. But this was actually the weaker scintillation, and you can see that the theory is following and picking up that bumps that's on the low frequency end. But the L-band scintillation, which itself is in saturation, is on the lower end, doesn't have that bump. And the theory pretty consistently picks it up. Now, if these things are strictly correct, I mean, this is a preliminary result, you would expect maybe the same power law index to come out of both of those. But the key point was in this part of the process, which we're still working on, is we're still tuning this model and actually putting more parameters into it. So I think the later results will give us more degrees of freedom. But the really interesting part about it is that it picked up the sensitivity of that peculiar variation in the propagation disturbance just by adjusting the parameters. So I think in a sense, this is really a first. This is the first time I've really seen physics level processing pulled out of a propagation measurement. Usually the propagation measurement, if you reduce it to weak scatter, or if you look at the phase, you can get some kind of an indication of what the underlying power law structures are. But to really pin that down, I always felt in my heart that the propagation theory was the most sensitive measure. And I think I'm really happy to present this for Charlie, and particularly in memory of Santi. I would have loved to have shown him this result, or maybe he even saw it, because it was as I said, the data were available for about 10 years. So as I'm evidently well within time for skipping the motivational part of this talk, let me just conclude with where I think this is going. It's well established that the intermediate scale ionospheric structure, and I mean in the hundreds of kilometer range down to hundreds of meters where you're into the diffusion range, is characterized by either a power law, a single power law, or a multi-component power law, and that characterization fits over that entire range. Now, there are very few measurements out there that push the windows of measurement beyond 10 kilometers or so, but there's no reason to do that. In other words, why stop at 10 if you've got 1,000 kilometers in your window? Why not analyze the whole 1,000 kilometers? And we've developed some techniques, some wavelet-based techniques for doing that. They're described on a website under my name in some papers that we're just about to publish. But I guess that rephrases just what I said. To reconcile the models and the data, I think is going to take two things, and this is my main conclusion, is that it's going to require some rethinking of the physics-based models. I mean, I'd really like to see some papers at a meeting like this where somebody genuinely attacked the intermediate scale range and says these are the conditions that drive different spectral index conditions, or even the two-component power law. Some of that stuff is out there, but the data measurements really show quite a range of structure under quite a range of conditions. And the question is how to explain that. And then once you have the theory pinned down, then we could come back to refining the propagation theory, putting those two pieces together and having a nice complement between scintillation and ionospheric physics. So that's all.